Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here to support Jeevika and to talk a little bit about India. My own interest is personal, professional, and now ministerial. I first went to India in the mid-60s, 65. I was a young student at the time, and it was a very different country from what we recognise today. Some of it was still a bit of the glow of independence. Nehru had died a few years earlier. But you were beginning to see some of the problems coming through. Corruption was beginning to become an issue. They just lost a humiliating war with China. I saw, as a visitor just travelling around the countryside, even in prosperous areas now, like Punjab and Haryana, there was real poverty and hunger, actually, in a way that is not the case today. So that was my first experience of the country. I've been back many, many times over the last 45 years. My late wife was Indian, so I had a family reason as well as a professional reason for going back. And I've seen the transformation that's occurred, which is a really remarkable one. You can date this at different times. I think probably the turnaround began to happen when Mrs. Gandhi was Prime Minister in the early 80s. There was the beginnings of a stirring of things have got to be done in a different way. A few tentative reforms, and that was then taken forward in the Narasimha Rao government with Manmohan Singh. And gradually the tempo of development growth picked up. And I think it was driven by a whole series of things. I think something we now tend to forget, that what was really driving development in India was peasant farming, small-scale farming in irrigated areas. That was where the road growth started to come from after the mid-60s, gradually getting momentum. And then Indian entrepreneurs began to start doing successful business in spite of the government, not because of it, working their way around the control system. And then this in turn fed a middle class, not in kind of British suburban middle class sense, but people with modest incomes, vast purchasing power, and that in turn drove the demand for consumer goods. And I think all these three things together then combined, and probably 2 decades ago you got the beginning of globalization, India really entering world markets, Indian companies becoming global, and a kind of transformation of a country that was, when I first went there, they used to talk about the Hindu rate of growth, 3.5%, to become one of the most dynamic economies in the world. And that transformation has happened, but of course there is another side to it, as we know. It was captured for me best in the novel by Arvind Adiga. I'm sure many of you have read it. And he has this concept, he describes life in Bangalore and these very exciting, dynamic places, and contrasts it with what he calls the darkness, which is the hundreds of millions of people who live in less progressive parts of India. He was really talking about Bihar, I think, at that time. But Bihar has changed, it's a good government and it's doing much better, but there are large parts of India which are largely untouched by this process of modernisation. And there is still extreme poverty. I'm not pessimistic about it, because I think even in those poorer areas you see improvements in living standards, nutrition's improving, even poorer people now have bicycles, mobile phones and so on. So there is a transformation, but you still have enormous concentrations of poverty. And that's why trusts like Jeevika are so important. I mean, that in a way leads on to my role in government. And why does it come down to voluntary bodies rather than government? And that leads on to the debate about aid and trade, which I think you asked me to say a little bit about. I think one of the things I say about my own government, and we get hammered from all sides, but I think one of the things we have done and got very little credit for is making a pledge at the outset that we would maintain our commitment to the international aid targets and sticking to them, despite having to do all kind of other terrible and unpleasant and politically unpopular things. We've stuck rigorously to that commitment and honoured it. We get no thanks from anybody and a lot of brickbats from certain newspapers, but we thought it was right. Not that it's politically productive or even commercially valuable, but it was just the right thing to do. Now, there is, as many of you know, quite a campaign building up to stop giving aid to India. You can see the populist argument. They've got Mr. Ambani and his £1 billion house, and they've got rockets and big armed forces with nuclear weapons. Why on earth do they want aid? And it is hard work, but I think right to make the case that in many parts of India, sensibly targeted aid can make a real difference to people's lives, and that's actually what it's about. It's not actually about politics or international trade. It's about basic humanity and doing practical things in a good way. And I feel that the aid we give at a government level is actually well worthwhile, and I'm happy to defend it. And of course, have defended it on television in front of hostile audiences, but you need to be aware of that context. But the work you do on a charitable basis will eventually have to replace what government's disengaging from gradually, and it's so much important that we therefore have this. Of course, the other side is that Britain needs to build up its relationship with India. I certainly feel, as in my other capacity as President of the Board of Trade, that we've let things slide with India, to be frank. Britain used to have a very well-established role in the Indian market through trade and investment. The market share now of British exporters is very poor, very poor. I think within the last few years there's been a real effort made, real effort, and we're now getting real growth. We got 25% last year of British exports to India, and that's an improvement. And we've got to sustain that for years to come. And if Patricia Hewitt had been there, I would have applauded the role that she and others are playing in all of that. So we've got to build up the trade side as well, in both directions, and investment in both directions. We've got a lot of Indian companies very active in the UK, Tata, of course, the biggest. And we've got British companies in India. We want to do more. We're putting quite a lot of store by getting an agreement with the Indians through the European Union, an economic cooperation, a trade agreement that will hopefully open up markets in both directions. And that's something we're negotiating at the moment. So the commercial side is important, and we'll continue to give priority to that.